Welcome to the Drake Group's webinar series on critical issues in collegiate athletics. Today's discussion, sports betting. What are the risks for intercollegiate athletics? Our moderator is Andrew Zimbalist, Robert A. Woods Professor Emeritus of Economics at Smith College.
Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar on sports betting. What are the risks for intercollegiate athletics? This is the 19th monthly webinar sponsored by the Drake Group Education Fund. We are fortunate today to be joined by prominent sports betting scholars and practitioners, whom I'll introduce in a few minutes. Events over the last 2 weeks at the University of Iowa State, the baseball team at Alabama University, and the Professional Soccer League in Brazil all remind us of the perils of sports betting. Similar scandals in waiting are likely to become widespread. Since the Supreme Court overturned PASPA in 2018, and allowed states to legalize sports betting, the sports betting industry's growth has been meteoric. According to the American Gaming Association, in 2022, the legal sports betting handle nationwide was $93.2 billion, an increase of over 70% from 2021. The interaction of this growth with the college sports industry is producing some very troubling effects. First, athletic departments, particularly in Division I, are in deep financial peril. According to data from 2019, the last year before the pandemic, the median FBS athletic department deficit was $18.8 million. And that is without counting a large chunk of capital and indirect expenditures. The situation has grown substantially worse with the impact of the pandemic, the 2021 Supreme Court decision in Alston lifting the cap on educational benefits to athletes, the evolution of NIL rights, which has diverted money away from sponsorships and donations that used to go to the athletic department, and the possible advent of revenue sharing and employee status for athletes. The result is that athletic departments are desperately seeking revenue and increasingly prone to partner with sportsbook companies. In some cases, not only are the sportsbook companies advertising and promoting betting on campus, but they are paying the school bonus income for each student who registers with their book. Thankfully, in recent weeks, under intense social and political pressure, several universities that signed sponsorship contracts with sportsbooks have either restricted or ended these deals. Second, there is the age-old problem of match fixing. In college sports where athletes are not paid in cash, they are vulnerable to match fixing overtures. The era of NIL has probably only made them more aware of the financial inequalities and exploitation that they face, and hence still more susceptible to the allure of income from match fixing. Third, college athletes who do not perform up to expectations or who miss a key play are not only subject to social media ridicule, but also to potential violence. Fourth, and perhaps most alarmingly, is the potential deleterious impact of gambling on college life. According to a 2018 study by the National Council on Problem Gambling, more than 75% of college students gamble in one form or another. It is very likely this percentage has only increased over the last 5 years. There are 16.3 million undergraduate students in U.S. colleges and universities. This implies that at least 12.25 million college students place bets. The National Council on Problem Gambling also notes that the rate of gambling problems among sports bettors is at least twice as high as among gamblers in general. When sports gambling is conducted online, the rate of problems is even higher, with one study on online sports indicating that 16% met clinical criteria for gambling disorder, and another 13% showed some signs of gambling problems. If we are conservative and use a lower percentage, just 10% of potential problem gamblers, then we can estimate that there are 1.2 million students in U.S. colleges and universities who either are at risk of becoming or are problem gamblers. Problem gamblers often fall into debt, and frequently this debt is to corrupt gambling rings. The potential for fear and ensuing violence only prompts the affected students to borrow, steal, and gamble more. The impact this will have on social relations in college dormitories and on study habits is foreboding. We have gathered some of the world's leading experts on sports betting, both scholars and practitioners, to discuss these issues, as well as what we can do about them. Declan Hill, a professor at the University of New Haven, has written two widely praised books on organized crime, corruption, and match fixing. Rebecca Cassidy, a British anthropologist at the University of London, has written two monographs on the horse racing industry and another ethnography on the modern commercial gambling industry. Dara McGee, an associate professor at the University of Bath in England, has published numerous articles on the relationship between gambling and sport, including how rapid industry expansion and technological innovation has engendered growing concerns about the well-being of young people. Brian Blair is the athletic director at the University of Toledo. He worked formerly in athletic administration at Washington State and Rice University. He has been an important voice in expressing concerns about the effects of sports betting on intercollegiate athletics. And finally, Tom McMillan, an old friend, former college and NBA player, former Olympian, former congressman from Maryland, current director of League One, and author of one of my favorite books on college sports, Out of Bounds, published way back in 1992, but still terrifically relevant today. I've asked each of the panelists to take up to 10 minutes to present some initial remarks on their work in this area. Rebecca, can we start with you, please?
Sure thing. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much. Thanks, Andy, and thank you for the invitation to join such a distinguished panel. I'm very much looking forward to our discussion. I'm an anthropologist at Goldsmiths, part of the University of London, as Andy said. I began my career working as a stable lass, very happily in Newmarket in the horse racing industry, and then spent some very exciting times in Kentucky. So I have some experience of the American scene, but primarily I work on the betting industry in the UK and internationally. My contribution to this seminar, I guess, is based on my experience of seeing just how the gambling industry in this country, in the UK, has changed from a totally insignificant and strictly controlled sector to a massive, lightly regulated industry. I don't have too much to say about the risks of match fixing that obviously come from that. I'll leave that to Declan and to others. The focus of my work is the impact that policies and products have on the public, especially young people. So what is our experience here in the UK? Well, in February this year, a study found that about 80% of university students gamble, very similar to the figures that Andy's just quoted. A quarter of them may be experiencing harm. What is striking to me is that half said that betting has affected their university experience, and that a third had used loans, overdrafts, or borrowed from friends to gamble. As we know, that's going to have a huge impact on their ability to sustain their studies. So one asks the question, well, how did we get here? The UK's Gambling Act came into force in 2007, and it was an archetypal product of the 1980s idea that the state should not interfere with people's choices about how they spend or make money, and the related idea that direct taxation should only be raised as a last resort. So the idea of read my lips, no new taxes, and so on. In the UK, this idea was applied in a very piecemeal way to sectors like alcohol, financial services, culminating in the Big Bang, broadcasting, energy, but also gambling. At that time, gambling was a moribund industry consisting of casinos, betting shops, arcades, bingo halls. We have always had a lot more regulated gambling than in the States, but it took place in very low-key venues. It could not be promoted. No advertising was permitted. The industry was only allowed to expand to meet what they called existing demand. So big amounts of money was lost by rich people, mostly men, in casinos, mostly in London, and on racecourses. Little bits of money, cash, but lots of it was lost with bookmakers in cash betting shops by working class punters. Middle class gambling was relatively small scale. Gambling by women was for the most part confined to bingo halls. The law itself was an out-of-date mix of paternalism and pragmatism. You shouldn't really bet, was the idea, but if you must, you can do so legally. So then we come to the 1990s, and enthusiastic free marketeers, including some of the Labour Party, so on both sides of the political spectrum, thought, why not allow people to have an enormous casino in their town if they want one? And they came up with a new act. So the Gambling Act was set up with the explicit aim of permitting gambling, except under very defined circumstances. So policymakers had no real understanding of online gambling, but embraced it enthusiastically. And the government designed policies to make the UK its international hub. The smartphone was invented shortly afterwards, and the rest, as they say, is history. We currently have a huge and very powerful gambling industry, the largest regulated market in the world, that is close to the levers of power, supporting both major parties and providing a source of income for the Treasury of about 3 billion, sorry. Gambling has become mainstream, popular with young people, the middle class, and women. Deals with Premier League soccer teams and players created new and aspirational connections between celebrity, sports, and betting. So what's it like then to try to explore this process as a researcher? I worked on gambling for 20 years. And in that time, I experienced and wrote about the structural difficulties of producing actionable evidence to support effective interventions that could prevent harm. Put simply, gambling companies hold all of the cards. There are a few things that they cannot do. So they can't become criminal enterprises. They can't tell lies about their odds. They can't deliberately target children in their marketing. However, everything else is available. If they do accept stolen money or send bonuses to people who've asked them to take them off their marketing lists, they receive large fines. However, they have no active responsibilities to show that their products are safe, for example, or to share data with academics or the public so that we can make informed decisions about how to use them. In short, they can tell researchers to go fish. In the UK, we know that people are killing themselves as a result of gambling, including young men who have asked to be removed from email lists and not to be contacted again. We know that others are getting into debt, losing their livelihoods, their health and relationships, and that it doesn't only affect gamblers, but also their families, friends, colleagues, staff, and employers. In the UK, even though the government claims to be taking a public health approach, they actually advocate self-regulation, and the industry cooperates by putting in place mostly downstream interventions like education programs. Common sense tells us that this is shutting the stable door after the horse has bolted. Public health tells us we should prevent harm by limiting the supply of dangerous products. So what has my experience taught me about this situation? The use of gambling to raise revenue for taxes creates dependencies that undermine democratic principles and processes. Gambling companies are the largest donors of gifts to UK parliamentarians. Gambling legislation should be overseen by health and social care departments, but it still creates dependencies in those contexts. Responsibility should be shifted onto the industry to provide evidence that new products are safe before they are released. Legislation should reject the damaging idea that gambling is safe, except for a small minority of people who are vulnerable in some shared way. We know in the UK that gambling harm can affect anyone. Legislation should not promote the idea of responsible gambling, which has been so helpful for the industry. It should focus on the problems that come from commercializing gambling. So this is my argument for, as an anthropologist, paying attention to the unnatural history of gambling. We actively create these ecologies, and therefore we can change them, even though the odds are stacked against us. Thanks.
Myself. Thank you very much, Rebecca. Dara, would you follow her? Thank you.
Yes, I'd be happy to. Thank you, Andrew, and it is a real pleasure to be here. My name is Darren McGee, and I feel very fortunate to be part of such a diverse panel, drawn, of course, from both sides of the Atlantic. And in that spirit, I should start with a little bit of biography, because although I'm a sociologist at the University of Bath in the UK, I feel just as important in this context today is that I've had the pleasure of playing intercollegiate sport myself for 4 years when I should have been concentrating on my doctorate at the University of Toronto in Canada. And today's event feels like some sort of validation in a way, because it's allowed me perhaps to forgive my lack of championship winning medals, and to critically reflect on perhaps why a gambling-free intercollegiate experience and a university campus indeed free from gambling and was a privilege in itself. And my contribution today really stems from research that picks up and begins in earnest the day that I left Canada to begin an academic post at the University of Bath back in 2015. Because aside from being a professional transition, it proved to be a cultural adjustment as well. One, of course, which was an adjustment to watching sport and to being a sports fan. In a UK context that, as Rebecca has kind of sketched already, was well on its way to becoming one of the most liberal but regulated gambling markets in the world by then. Since that point, I've been trying to understand what Rebecca herself might call the manufacture of this sports gambling industry, how it's designed and promoted, expanded and adapted according to a tried and tested playbook. And really, to emphasize Rebecca's very, very prescient comments, this is an unnatural history, as she puts it. We're interested here in the design, the manufacture, the construction of an industry rather than its natural evolution from the past. My research since then has revealed a newly commercial sporting landscape that is enthralled to a gambling industry that has itself undergone a transformation. One terraformed by rapid innovations in digital technology, the rise of surveillance capitalism, targeted advertising, and for want of a better word, corporate greed. This so-called gamblification of sport has led to the commodification, as I see it, of authentic sites and cherished scenes of sport, from the naming rights to historic stadia, the sponsorship of community-anchored football clubs or sports clubs more broadly in the context of today's event, athlete endorsements, and much more besides. We've also seen, of course, televised coverage become saturated with gambling advertising, and that's something that my North American colleagues and friends regularly get in touch now to say, I get it, in ways that they certainly didn't get prior to 2018. More than that, this is manifest in a culture shift. As I see it in sport, it's manifest in the rise of a fan culture that's increasingly colonized by talk of gambling odds, free bets, cash outs, accumulators. Suddenly, friends and peers spend the game engrossed in smartphones, hooked on rapid fire in play, or in a US context, prop betting markets that carve up what was once a single betting opportunity into hundreds of micro events. It will be no surprise to many on this call to hear that so many young men in particular, much of my work has been on young men in particular, and they tell me gambling is increasingly essential to their enjoyment of sport. And so this cultural hijacking of sport is really what I'm getting at. And the result of that is a blurring of the lines, I think, between sports fandom and gambling. And what we've increasingly got is a leisure form that promises to raise the stakes and amplify the rush of consuming sport. And certainly, I think the US has seen what we've been seeing here in the UK and more closely in Ireland for a decade now. The reality, however, is that the profound appeal of online sports gambling has led to dire consequences for so many people here in the UK. My own research has uncovered tales of young people whose everyday lives are punctuated by deepening social and financial precarity, high interest payday loans, bank debt, mortgage defaults, family breakdown, and of course, as Rebecca so poignantly noted, suicide. These harms, of course, not only affect individuals but of ripple effects into wider family, friends, employers, communities, and of course, university campuses, as we're seeing in the US context. In recent years, I think it's important to note that I've worked as part of a research team tracing the expansion of commercial gambling across sub-Saharan Africa, where the uptake and embrace of European football has been followed by the export of an industry playbook that preaches responsible gambling at the same time as it aggressively promotes products to the most useful continents on Earth. And it's really against that backdrop that I approach today's panel. It's a backdrop, of course, that makes me think a lot about the playbook that is exported and which is embraced both sides of the Atlantic right now. And by way of initial provocation, perhaps for a discussion to come, I would like to make two very quick points. The first is derived from the abstract itself, and which Andrew is further situated. And that is this idea that college sport is in a desperate state of financial peril. And I consider that to be deeply worrisome because it really lends itself to the playbook that Rebecca and I have been discussing, and which we've seen replicated in the alliance between gambling firms and football clubs in the English Premier League and down the Football League structure, where the pleading of poverty by sporting authorities has really served to depoliticize the decision to accept gambling industry monies. Suddenly, the decision to accept such gambling industry revenues is presented as a matter of survival on behalf of those sporting actors, rather than, of course, a matter of moral or a question of moral and ethical integrity. The gambling industry itself, of course, is also cast in a role as generous benefactor and supporter then of sport in general, and in the US context right now, as a supporter of college sport in particular. That already begins to shape the narrative on college campuses across the US. And I think that's a deeply worrisome area to really consider today. And the second concerns a term that tends to dominate panels on sports betting, and that is the term integrity, which in this context tends to focus on the threat of individual athletes fixing games, thereby corrupting the enshrined values of competition and the integrity, of course, of sporting meritocracy. And while that's vital, as I'm sure Declan and other colleagues will establish in due course, I think that shouldn't be at the cost of a wider framing of integrity, one which turns the critical gaze away from the athletes and onto the gambling industry and their deepening alliance, in this case with educational institutions, but also with sport more broadly. I think when we do this, we move away from a moral individualism that is in danger of imposing responsibility on young athletes, and we can begin to hold more powerful institutional actors accountable for their commercial relationships and how they shape campuses across America today. And so it's on that note that I will stop. I'm very much looking forward to further discussion and to the questions that will no doubt come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dara. Declan, can I ask you to follow Dara? Unmute yourself.
Yes, it'll be an absolute honor. The NCAA, indeed, American sports, indeed, the entire country of America is in the crosshairs of two enormous tsunamis. Now, one tsunami, Tom and Blair and Andrew and I and everybody's on the panel has seen, and that's a tsunami of malarkey. I'd use another word, but I don't want to shock anyone on this panel or any of our delicate listeners and viewers here, but it is flowed through state houses, legislatures, courtrooms, news rooms, across our television and computer screens since May 14th, 2018. The bookmakers and the sports gambling industry has sold this country a tsunami, a tidal wave of malarkey, that sports gambling is completely beneficial. It is a social pleasure without harm, that it has no risks and doesn't need to be regulated. It's deeply, deeply invidious. It's addictive. It is a sign of, in my opinion, the bankruptcy of the corporate world now, that as the opioid epidemic is becoming recognized, it's just been announced that 108,000 Americans died last year from the opioid epidemic. The corporate world is now looking for a new form of addiction. Second tsunami is one that is generally not known. And now I play the part, as Blair will recognize, of Paul Revere riding through the night, ringing the bell, saying the Americans are coming. Tom, the tsunami that is lapping at the shores of America, we've already seen ebbs of it coming into our sport, is the tsunami of match fixing around the world. It's very, very difficult to overstate how bad the match fixing is in sports leagues around the world. There's a graveyard, as Dara will testify, of sports that have been killed off by match fixing linked to a new form of gambling. We've always had match fixing. I don't want to, hey, guess what? There's this new thing called match fixing. If you're going back to the ancient Olympic site in Greece, you'll see a row of statues. And those statues were built with the money they took from athletes and coaches and teams that were caught cheating and fixing back then. So I'm not suggesting that match fixing is something new, but I am, Blair and Andrew, saying that the globalized sports gambling, the market that the European Police Agency has estimated at $1.63 trillion, instantaneous on our phones, has created a wave of match fixing around the world. Now, as some of you know, I infiltrated one of the gangs of match fixers that travel around the world. They fix major sporting tournaments, be it the Olympics, the World Cup, major tennis tournaments, soccer, cricket. And I've seen these guys in action. And the essential paradigm that they do is those fixers fix the gambling market, this $1.63 trillion, and they use local criminals to fix the local markets. And that we have seen. When I finish this panel, I'm going on Brazilian television, TV Globo, to talk about the wave of match fixing that has hit their sports leagues. One of the things that I want to talk about is that the sports leagues in Brazil, their top divisions, this incubus of great soccer playing has been hit. But I'm coming on Brazilian television to talk about how 15-year-olds are now fixing their games in Brazil. That's the kind of tsunami that's gone on. I've testified in over 30 national police investigations around the world in this match fixing. As Andrew will testify and confirm, the MLS had their first player suspended 2 days ago because the betting odds seemed to indicate that he was deliberately taking a bribe to get a yellow card. Hasn't been proven yet, but that is certainly the allegation and why the Major League of Soccer has suspended him. The final point that I want to leave before I get to more of our distinguished panel is, what does this mean for the NCAA? What are these two enormous tsunamis that are coming and sweeping over American sport going to do? The basic rule from the Middle Ages onwards is you can't run a nunnery out of a brothel. No disrespect to people who live in nunneries, and no disrespect to people who live in brothels. But you can't have two institutions with fundamentally different external goals inside the same institutions. You can't have an education, an academic education, being funded, taking money from bookmakers, and not expect negative consequences, be it addiction, be it all kinds of challenges to match fixing. Specifically when so many of the, quote, student athletes are receiving no money. It is a recipe for disasters, as Andrew has already spoken about. Thank you. I am honored to be here. Rebecca and Dara's work I know very, very well. Andrew, unfortunately, I'm his president of his fan club. I've read every syllable of his books that he's read, and it's an honor to be here. Thank you so much, guys, for having me. Happy to chat afterwards.
Thanks so much, Declan. Brian, Blair, can we turn to you next?
Absolutely. And excited that I don't live in a nunnery or a brothel. So I get to start the day off with a win right there. Really appreciate you being here today. I think I maybe come at it from a little bit different angle. Just being in the industry, working in college athletics. And as I thought about today's panel and kind of what's top of mind for me, starts with student athlete welfare. What I've noticed is, so January of this year, gambling went live in the state of Ohio. And as I make my rounds as AD and I'm greeting our season ticket holders and premium seat holders and the like, what I noticed was everybody had their phone in their hand, but they weren't on Instagram, they weren't on Twitter. A lot of them were on betting apps for the first time. And I felt like many of our attendees were enamored with kind of this new toy that had popped up, and there was all these free opportunities to engage and access the platform. And maybe it shouldn't have taken me off guard, but I just didn't see it spreading and the interest popping up like it did, to the point that it put me on my heels a little bit. And anytime when somebody would ask me, well, who's playing today? How do we look tonight? I had to second guess, right? For all the reasons you guys have outlined. But I can't say that's always been the case. You didn't always have maybe that anxiousness, but it's introduced that notion to top of mind. But as I think about how that translates to our student athletes, and they're all on social media and pretty easily accessible via those means, and we use that for a lot of good. But I also think they face a lot of pressures now from those that are placing bets on their game. And that's always been present. And a lot of times I'll get emails to my inbox, or others will, saying, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? And there's no clear reason why they should care about that other than the odds of a game or gambling or the like. But I fear that you're going to start seeing that trickle down to our student athletes. And with the increased interest that gambling brings, which is certainly something we welcome, because we want more fans and more viewers and more everything. But with that increased interest for maybe the wrong reasons, I think the pressures on our student athletes to perform a certain way or to react in a certain way or to do certain things certainly ramps up too. And I'm not certain, or actually I am certain, we don't holistically and have not done a good enough job of preparing our student athletes for what that good should look like. So that's a big concern of mine, because I feel like in some ways we're playing catch up because of the way gambling has been legalized in patchworks across the United States. So everybody's kind of handling it on their own. So I worry about the student athlete welfare. I think second, and Dara, you mentioned a little bit about this, just the integrity of the game from a number of different standpoints, not necessarily strictly from a price fixing a game or something along those lines, but I also think from just a communication mechanism within college athletics, I'm not sure we're ready for all this. I think if you look at some of the professional leagues and what they do, whether it be injury reports or how they communicate facts and data or protect certain things, and I just think we're woefully behind in college athletics and not ready for that yet. Is here, and we're trying to figure it out. And I feel like sometimes when I ask questions about should we standardize injury reports or should we take some of these steps, you kind of get looked at as you had three heads. But now it's front and center, and we're paying attention to it more and thinking about more of all the infrastructure around college athletics. How does gambling impact it, and should we be prepared, or should we alter what we traditionally do? I think it's easy even for our student athletes on what they post on social media or who they interact with or who they talk to, who's running in the circles, what the classmate beside them that's asking for extra information. I mean, these are small individual examples, but I think they add up to a pretty big difference maker. And so this is a different world we're operating in. And I think last and least important to me, but certainly something we always consider is just how does this fit into the business model? Should it fit into the business model? I think those are two distinct questions, right? Should we profit off of and or include gambling, sports books in our facility plans, our revenue plans, our promotions plans to increase interest? And then when you do, what does that look like? And how do you do that in a way that doesn't accelerate the other two issues I pointed out in terms of the student athlete welfare and the integrity of game? And can you? I think the benefit that we have within college athletics is the rest of the country, or not the rest of the country, but the rest of the world, in some ways has dipped their toe in this field already. So there's a lot of lessons to learn. And I think my panelists have spelled that out pretty clearly, that there's a lot going on. On the flip side, not all of it's great, right? And so what do you learn from that? And how can we make sure we don't trip over the same stone that's already been tripped over? So I think a little bit of it is we're trying to learn. At the same time, this bike's here and we got to ride it. And it came quick, and we're trying to figure it out. So I think as a practitioner within college athletics, those are some of the things that, if you want to say keep me up at night, or some things that are top of mind for me. But it starts with the student athletes, then trickles down to the integrity game and all the things we do within college athletics that might have implications. And then the business model, at least importantly, but certainly a piece of information that we're trying to analyze.
Thank you so much, Brian, for those comments. Tom, would you like to finish up with the initial remarks?
Well, thank you very much, Andrew, and certainly appreciate being on this distinguished panel, certainly with Brian, one of our member schools. Let me just step back and say the big picture here. The United States is the only country in the world where big-time sports betting is occurring on campus events. I mean, I always recall back at Oxford, I'm sure Rebecca would appreciate this. When I was at school there, the big sports event held in London was the London Cambridge Crew race. And there was a lot of betting on that, but I knew of no betting on any campus events at Oxford. So we're unique in that sense, in that this is really occurring on our college campuses, on events on our college campuses. And remember, these universities are our crown jewels. I mean, they are the most important part of our economy in a lot of ways. And, here we could see scandals really engulf these schools. And so that's of concern. When you turn to the NCAA, they've been flying blind. I'm glad to see Charlie Baker, the new president, say they're going to update their study. I've been pushing for this because really their data is literally irrelevant right now, because we now have a legalized market. 30 plus states are doing this in a very active role. And we need to know better data as to how many of our student athletes are actually betting. And then we need to look at the policy side of this. You look at the NBA, their rules, they say, you don't bet on our games if you're an official player, whatever, but you can go to the casino and bet. You can bet on a whole lots of things. We recall seeing Michael Jordan in casinos when he was playing. The NFL says don't bet our games, and particularly don't bet on our games while you're in one of our venues. Colleges, it gets a little more complicated. They say to the kid, you can't bet on any sports in which the NCAA has a championship. So certainly that's the NFL, the NBA. But if you want to go bet on NASCAR or horse racing, be my guest. And so maybe the NCAA's policy needs to be reviewed, because as you look at what's happening in Iowa and Iowa State and so forth, because Alabama is a little different, you begin to see players being caught in the act of gambling, but we don't know exactly to what extent they are. But it is an area that needs to be clarified. Certainly these are kids that their brains are not fully formed yet. There's lots of issues with problem gambling. So maybe the policy needs to be reviewed in some respects, because when people say, well, what would it take to have a major scandal in college sports with respect to sports betting? And I always define a scandal as broad public outrage. Well, we saw Alabama, we saw Iowa, we saw Iowa State. I wouldn't call any of those broad public outrage. We saw what in the NFL, it wasn't broad public outrage. What occurred in Germany in 2009 when they had 200 soccer players, soccer teams across 9 countries be involved in a massive scandal that not only hit to the core of integrity, but raised all kinds of risks to those individual athletes. That's a scandal. So if I were to say what would be a corresponding scandal in America, it would involve hundreds of schools and hundreds of players, and the presidents of those universities are going to be on their front page newspaper. That's what I see as a scandal. And the reason why I think it's destined to happen in America, because I think what Rebecca said is our regulatory structure is so fragmented, so patchwork, so unlike Europe, where there's one regulatory body over the whole gambling industry. And I see, like my own state of Maryland, where they pass a gambling bill, sports betting bill, and the money's all going to go into public education. Well, that's good. Public education is important. But, some of this money ought to go back to these athletic departments. Brian Blair has to spend money on compliance and integrity to protect himself, and he makes nothing on it. The only way that I think is legitimate for these schools to make money is, if the conference can sell some official data and so forth. But for them to have to sell sponsorships and those kinds of things just to pay the bills to stay out of trouble, I think is very contradictory in my view. And so I do think that any university wanting to get into this business, which is here to stay, needs to have a strong education program, strong compliance. Their health center needs to be integrated on problem gambling. They need to create safe harbors for kids so that if they are engaging in sports betting, that they can call someone without getting in trouble. So there's a lot to be done. This is a topic that's not going to go away. I personally think we need federal legislation on this matter. Here we are running in Congress trying to get NIL and all those kinds of things. I think the bigger issue down the road will be, can we get to a national sports betting framework in this country that really protects the crown jewels of this country, our universities? Thank you, Ed.
Thank you very much, Tom. Tom, let me stick with you for the first question. You mentioned at the end that you think we need national legislation. I want to ask you about what that would include. But you also mentioned that somewhat critically that the NCAA prohibition on gambling only applies to schools that or sports for which the NCAA has championships. And so, for instance, it's fine, according to the NCAA rules, it's fine for students to bet on horse racing or on NASCAR. What do you think the NCAA should be doing beyond broadening the number of sports that would be prohibited? What can they do, and in your view, what can your athletic directors do? What can the institutions do to begin to mollify and alleviate some of the extreme problems that are starting to emerge?
Well, when I spoke to Governor Baker when he took the job, I said it's very important that you get current data. We need data because, ask Brian how many of his players are engaged in any form of sports betting. I mean, I've asked 100 ADs and no one really knows the answer. We need hard data, and we need to know what they're betting on, whether it's an office pool or whatever. And then that should drive the kind of policy considerations you want. But right now we have a policy in place without data. And so I think that's kind of flawed. On the congressional thing, I actually think that, this issue will grow. And I also understand how Congress works. There's got to be, to get Congress to move, and a lot of times it requires a crisis, because that's just the way Congress operates. Look at the debt ceiling. It's, until we're right at the bitter end, they won't even get a bill done. But if there's a crisis that spans multiple schools in sports betting, that will get Congress's attention. And so I do see that day coming. And that's why I say the odd part about this is that here the NCAA is working on non-employment issues and NIL, but you've got this looming issue of sports betting, which could be actually more important than anything else down the road.
Brian, what kind of support would you like to see from the NCAA to help you begin to get a handle on the growing problem?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think Tom touched on a lot. I think in terms of you see what happened at some of my fellow institutions, and I think a lot of administrators across the country started scrambling, asking the question, well, what do we do? What should we do? And certainly there's an industry out there that can help you with integrity and educating your student athletes and the like. But that also comes with a cost. And sometimes that can be prohibitive, certain departments. And so as states make money off of gambling and others do, I think to Tom's point, some help or assistance there could be really helpful. I think as far as the NCAA goes, we just got to wrap our mind around it. We've got state by state legislation on this, just like some other topics that we're talking about right now, and everybody's battling a different battle. And there's no unified standard across the board for what we need to do and what best protects and serves our student athletes. That's got to be the center of everything we do. And right now, we're all over the place. And for the longest, it's been don't bet on it, don't bet on it, don't bet on it. And I realize that's a sticky saying, and it's nice to spout off. The reality is some of our kids are betting on it. I don't know that for a fact here at Toledo, as Tom said, but I wouldn't bet my house against it, for lack of better words. I think it's so popular right now. It's everywhere around us. We've got to be really smart in terms of how we educate against it. I will say on the positive side, the fact that as these states legalize gambling, you had some early instances actually get caught and or found is a positive sign, and something we've used to try to educate our student athletes that there are more eyeballs, there are more people watching. This is more complicated than just us saying no and nobody's going to find out. And maybe that can be prohibitive to them engaging in that behavior. But I think there's deeper reasons why we should or should not create certain rules. And I think some of that goes back to data. Some of that goes back to what's in the best interest of our student athletes and how do we protect them. So it's one thing to say, don't bet on sports we sponsor, but you can bet on everything else. But I'm not sure that gets to the deeper issues or deeper trends that they can expose themselves to long term. And so if we're going to do it, let's do it not only to protect our industry, but also to protect the student athletes. And that's where I think not only the data, but the research and information behind it, that a lot of times we can learn from other leagues.
Excellent. Declan, I think I saw you shaking your head for a moment there. Do you have?
I want to ring a clarion bell. I want to get on the horse and keep saying, with respect to Rebecca, the British are coming. Sorry about this, Rebecca, about that. But look, we just got, what Blair Bryan has just said is here he is. He's in charge of a major sports department at a university, and he's not getting any money. He's not getting any resources as this tsunami of gambling is coming down. They're not paying him any cash to protect his athletes. And Tom, in response to your data thing, there is a wave. It's a silent plague of addiction to gaming and gambling among young athletes. They are not only prone to more addiction, they are doing it constantly. What is needed here, as Tom has said, is federal regulation. Andrew, as you know, Senator Blumenthal and the Drake Group were speaking about this a number of years ago to try and put some kind of framework. But as Tom said, we're waiting for that crisis because no one will move until the inevitable crisis happens. But I would suggest the fundamental key that every American sports official should remember is it doesn't matter if there is actually a challenge to, quote, the integrity of the sport. It doesn't matter if your players are actually corrupt. It's whether enough of the audience, enough of your fan base has a reasonable doubt in what they've just seen. That's the spelling the end of your sport. When your fans are looking at the touchdown that shouldn't have happened with a Hail Mary pass in the final second, they're like, did we just see the beauty of sport or did we just see a piece of theater? And that's where the crumbling of a sport's popularity takes place. And you can go and look at the nightmare of Taiwanese baseball, which has been wrapped up in this, in Chinese soccer. Yet again, they've had yet another match fixing issue. Around the world, we're seeing these crises, we're seeing these things. And rare for America, Americans are asleep at the wheel at this one.
So, Declan, you also are referencing, as Brian and Tom did, the need for national legislation. What should be in that national legislation to help us get some control over this problem?
One is the discussion of gambling as an addictive product. This is as addictive as tobacco, it's as addictive as alcohol, it's as addictive. Arguably, many of these new forms of gambling is as addictive as some narcotics like heroin. Two, we need a federal agency that can receive the funding, this vast billions that the sports gambling is making out of the NCAA and all these other American sports leagues, and get it to guys like Brian. Get it in an arm's length relationship so Brian has clear blue water between the cash he's receiving and the bookmakers. So nobody can accuse the Ohio State University or any of the others of having an implication in this. The sports gambling industry, which is profiting billions of dollars off these sports, should be paying to protect these sports from the challenges.
Rebecca, you, among many suggestions that you were making, one of them, I think you said we shouldn't have legislation that supports the notion of responsible gambling. And so how would you go about controlling that? Clearly, there are lots of ads on television in the United States these days, from FanDuel and from MGM and others, where they lead by saying we're in the business of promoting responsible gambling, and so is that notion itself deleterious? Is it dangerous? Should we never use those two words? Should it be an oxymoron? How would you deal with it?
Yeah, I think an anthropologist from NYU, Natasha Schull, has described the creation of the idea of responsible gambling by the American gaming industry and how that enabled them to promote the idea that gambling is safe for normal people, in inverted commas, and to then pathologize people who suffer gambling harm, and to create an idea that they are vulnerable in some shared way, and to then enable them to create a business model that says we should be able to operate without restriction so long as we can provide treatment for these few people who have an addictive personality and would, if they were not in trouble because of gambling, be suffering because of alcoholism or drugs or something else. So this is, in other words, not our fault. It is an inherent flaw in this small group of people. And therefore they shift the moral blame and they operate then with impunity. And governments have accepted this framing entirely, and that is why we're in the situation that we are in now, where downstream interventions are accepted as public health measures, which is a nonsense. I mean, I just wanted to respond to what Tom said as well. I feel the scandal is already here in the US, to me. The idea that what you've described is a scandal already. The idea as well, Tom, that that hard data will influence policy. In our experience, I'm sure Dara will also be able to speak to this. In my experience working with academics all over the world, evidence does not shift policy, I'm afraid. I hate to be cynical about this, but it is actually horrible things that have changed policy. It's suicides, it's people losing their livelihood and so on, it's crime and so on. And I feel like that's another thing that we have to be really straightforward about. Gambling policy is not evidence-based.
Dara, do you have any comments on this front?
Yeah, I mean, the caveat is that I'm following the pioneering voice on the need for independence from industry, and I cannot put it any stronger than Rebecca does. I wholeheartedly agree. I have the word scandal ! Circle, circle, circle in my notes here to speak to that very idea that we've yet to see the scandal. And I guess just to add to what Rebecca said, the scandal for me is also has cultural consequences. The scandal is cultural. By allowing the gambling firms direct entry point into university campuses, into university sport, you've already legitimated their presence in communities. You have opened the door. You've allowed them a direct point, a trusted space in which to speak directly to young people. And that has consequences. And we've seen in the UK, I see it in sub-Saharan Africa as well. That is straight out of the playbook. You know, capture cherished cultural spaces in which people trust what they hear. And I think, you know, that's where, and Tom mentioned the word dependency, and there's been a lot of discussion about the financial flows. The truth is, when we get to the point when we're discussing pragmatic solutions to where the financial flows from the gambling industry might support intercollegiate sport, we need to be very worried because the fox is already in the hen house at that point, and we're trying to make the best of what we can at that point.
Yeah, go ahead, Declan.
I just want to add something. This is so old news to Rebecca and Dara. It's just accepted what they know, but it's a big headline for us in North America. The UK Gambling Commission, which is in my opinion, problematic agency, but it, quote, oversees much of the British gambling industry. It's an agency we don't have in America or Canada. It just doesn't exist. But in a recent report, they talked about the tens of thousands of teenage gambling addicts. And when I say teenage, Brian, I'm not talking 18. I'm talking somewhere between 14 and 17. And Tom, I'm not talking about, you know, the guy that happens to wander into a betting shop. I'm talking about tens of thousands of people whose brain chemistry is essentially being eroded at 14, 15, 16 as they're gambling away thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands in some cases. So this is a massive issue already with teenagers and adolescents in the UK.
Brian or Tom, do you want to chip in here or move on to another question?
No, let me just kind of make one quick point. I couldn't agree more with what was said, and I totally agree with those sentiments. We did a webinar on this subject a couple of weeks ago before the Alabama, Iowa State incidents, and everybody who was an expert on that call said there's 100% probability of a major scandal within 3 years. Well, it's all, and many said it's already happening, which is what some of our panelists today said. What my point about this is that from my perch as a former policymaker, until it's front page newspapers, until a president's on the front page of the newspaper, until this rises to that level, it's so hard to get our legislators' attention. And that's what I think is coming, where I wouldn't want to be the president who, whether it's the Orlando paper, the Houston paper, or any of those papers that has my university, and I'm front and center on that. And that's why it is such a explosive issue. And on top of all that, as college sports is going through this major change, they're talking about employment, they're talking about, kids getting more money and commercializing enterprise even more. All of a sudden, you're going to have these events that are going to blow up on our campuses, and policymakers are going to say, wait a minute, listen, I know sports betting's here to stay, but I didn't want it to destroy our universities. And I think that will be a sobering thought.
So about 6 years ago, Adam Silver, the commissioner of the NBA, had an op-ed in the New York Times. And I think it really flipped the scales in the United States about how the sports industry was responding to gambling. Until Adam had that op-ed, betting was universally proscribed across sports in the United States. And Adam came out with this argument: we might as well legalize it, because once we legalize it, we'll be able to regulate it. We'll be able to identify cheaters. We'll be able to identify match fixing, and hence we'll be able to control it. Declan, what's your view on that? Is regulation an effective way to control match fixing?
Yeah, I remember that. It was actually November 2013, and I remember it because I was in Estonia in a bookmaker's headquarters, watching a game being fixed in Asia. We were watching the gambling odds, and there was an NBA executive there as well on a kind of reconnaissance mission. And I remember it was, Adam Silver's op-ed rang through that room as it popped up. It was just an absolute clangor. And I don't mean that in the British sense of a mistake. I mean, it just, everybody paid attention, and that was a sound that this industry was going to change. Look, despite my description of tsunami of malarkey by the gambling industry, I'm very strongly in favor of legalized gambling. I just think it should be regulated. And I think the conversation should be moved out of the, frankly, tactics of the tobacco industry, where, this thing is described as an individual choice, and there's the capture, as Dara said so brilliantly, the capture of our cultural spaces. I think we've got to have responsible regulation and discussion of the cost of addiction, the cost of people like Brian, for people of Brian, of how to best protect their athletes and how to best protect their sport. So regulation is desperately needed. And sadly, what we've had now is the Oklahoma land rush kind of approach to sports gambling, where it's bang, bang, and then all the bookmakers start running across the territory to acquire and accumulate as much territory as possible.
So let me re-ask the question. Your comment is interesting, but I don't think you answered my question, which is, can regulators effectively, maybe not eliminate, but greatly reduce the amount of match fixing?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
And do you think that that's happened? Is there evidence from Europe or elsewhere where
Yeah, look,
that
here's one thing that is just utterly beyond what anybody in America has done yet in this field. The Australians have got a dedicated police unit who've trained themselves specifically on match fixing issues, how to read the chart. I know this because I've trained a number of their detectives, and we've had a number of their people into my Center for Sports here at the University of New Haven. The FBI sadly has talked big about this, but they've never actually set up a properly funded, properly established unit to help guys like Brian, who'll be coming into them in 1, 2, 3, 5 weeks from now or years from now and saying, hey, I've got this issue. Which bookmaker do I look at? Oh, by the way, the center of sports gambling around the world is now in the Philippines, in Manila. It's not in Las Vegas. This kind of basic stuff that is needed. So that's one thing that they can do, Andrew. The other one is a properly independent center for education about addiction. Athletes are terrible gamblers. Everything that makes them very, very good at athletics makes them terrible gamblers, and they become addicted at far higher rates than the norm. So these kind of discussions, this kind of regulation that can properly protect people hasn't been addressed, hasn't even been started to be discussed in America, and that can be done quite easily.
and what do we do about the growth of offshore betting? It is also exploding. The mechanisms of control seem to be greatly diminished. Is there some set of policies that could be introduced to at least reduce the magnitude of that problem?
Oh gosh, absolutely. And it's, we could hold a series of seminars just on that one question you've asked, because offshore gambling is really the heart and soul of the gambling industry. It's really where much of it exists. And everything that we're seeing now, all these kind of purported giants of American sports gambling, are just the literal economic tip of the iceberg. It's a massive, massive scale offshore. And yes, it can be dealt with, but the regulation,
But how?
the legislation,
As we start to regulate legal betting, so-called legal betting, more and more bettors are going to move offshore because then they don't have to pay taxes and they're not as visible to the regulators, right? And so what you say, we can control it, but what are the mechanisms to control offshore betting?
Well, first of all, let's look at, I don't want to take too many people's time, but let's just look at one thing, which is the challenge of match fixing to a guy like Brian. You can regulate, you can watch that offshore market, and you can establish that unit that works inside that offshore market, understanding what's happening and understanding that flow of what's going on there. So that's just one thing that you can do. And unfortunately, at this moment, American law enforcement hasn't even begun to tackle the issue of sports gambling and what it will do. But sports officials haven't begun to understand that if you're running this, quote, brothel out of your nunnery, if you're bringing in the sports gambling industry, their students are going to be running offshore fast and furiously. And we need to be able to get that education in and that central looking and making sure that our students are educated into that dangers. Andrew, I know I'm skipping over a lot of things, but I don't want to dominate this conversation.
Thank you. That's fine. And so either Dara or Rebecca, is there anything that's been done in Europe to reduce the scope of gambling or to blunt its impact that you think has been successful? I think I've read that advertising by sports books has been restricted in some legislation. Is that a useful thing? Are there other measures that have been taken that the United States can learn from?
Just on the black market stuff, Andrew, I before we add anything that's been successful here, I would also look at the other side of that, which is, IP blocking and so on has been proven to be have very varied rates of success to do with implementation and resourcing to regulators and so on. So I think it's a very mixed picture. But the other side of things is, of course, looking at banking. And the UK, I think, Dara, I'm sure, will be far more knowledgeable about this than me, but is leading, I think, in looking at open banking and how it's possible to assess a sort of expenditure and so on, and to block illegitimate gambling operators that way. So I think there's more space for that, but it's right at the beginning of that technology. I'd say that many of the measures that have been adopted in the UK are voluntary, and the industry consistently uses a strategy of staying just ahead of regulation. So there's a public outcry about something, the industry makes a measure, in tried and trusted strategy that sort of is a gesture towards improving the situation. The regulators back off, and so we had that sort of dance going on. So recently we've had a white paper, but before that came out, the industry volunteered to take logos off the fronts of shirts. What that did was to put off more intrusive measures that might have actually better controlled things. So it's that kind of dance. I'll hand over to Dara.
Dara?
Yeah, I mean, Rebecca's commented on several of those issues. I guess the first thing to say is that, don't look across the Atlantic for the answers, because so many of the lessons, of course, have been learned from what's happened in the UK, adapted, refined. The loopholes that remain open on this side have been very much embraced, but there's also kind of lessons that have been learned here which are being used to circumvent legislation in the States, no doubt. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that the irony of technology and the gambling industry is, of course, that they're right there at the forefront. They have commandeered the technologies that the Silicon Valley gave us. They weaponized them in ways that we don't even understand at this point. And yet the reality is that they've got such a closed shop that the same technology is never used when it comes to consumer protections or kind of transparency. Then they have generally no idea as to how we might solve some of the big problems we face. In terms of the white paper that Rebecca has mentioned, I'm not sure how much exposure that has had on that side of the water, but there recently have been one groundbreaking study in particular has used bank data, and has given rise to fascinating findings, particularly on kind of the quantum of harm that the gambling industry don't want you to think about or see. And of course, there's been so much talk about data today, and the reality here in the UK is, as Rebecca has been at the forefront of kind of exposing, is that one of the great successes for the gambling industry has been an evidence void that has always kind of been gamed in their favor. A lack of information has always suited the gambling industry, and they've been brilliant at keeping it that way. And our lobbying scandals on this side of the water recently, I'm not sure how much exposure you've had in the States, have been nothing short of scandalous. It comes back to Rebecca's point there that even with the hard data, you don't change policy making, and the lobbying scandals on this side, the investigative stings and the whistleblowing have been really important recently. In terms of advertising, unfortunately, the UK is not the panacea. If there is one gaping hole and there are many gaping holes, but one of the most kind of gaping is indeed on advertising. And as Rebecca said, the voluntary withdrawal of gambling logos on Premier League football shirts was really a red herring on this side to divert attention away from the fact that the status quo would remain relatively untouched. That in reality, the gambling logos were moving to the sleeves, which is progress, but not when the status quo remains as it is. So by no means are there answers on this side for us. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. So we only have just a little bit more than 15 minutes, and we have a bunch of questions. So I think I should turn to the audience questions. First one is a question from Sandy Thatcher. He asks, are team sports such as football, basketball, lacrosse, baseball, more susceptible to match fixing than individual sports, swimming, track, tennis, golf, etc., and therefore more at risk of being undermined by gambling? Any takers to that one?
Yeah, great question, Sandy. This is in my wheelhouse, so I'll take this. The biggest sport, which is utterly, which is really in an existential crisis now, is tennis. Tennis has got appalling problems with match fixing because it's so easy to fix. You remember the old days of boxing and combat sports, which has long had a problem with fixing. Well, in those days, well, boxing still has issues, but somebody actually had to take a punch. Somebody actually had to have physical contact and be knocked out or something. In tennis, if you want to fix a match, it's Sandy and Declan playing a game, and then Declan clutches his hamstring on the second game of the second set and says, "Oh, I'm sorry, that's it, game fixed." And so it's rife. I was speaking with a match fixer a couple of years ago who's part of an Armenian Russian mafia gang that has been fixing games across tennis. And he said, look, some of the days we have so many fixed matches in tennis that we're turning players down. The second thing I want to emphasize is one of our first questions, which is from a gentleman, Lawrence Cohen, which is talking about the elephant in the room, which is, do you have to pay the athletes? And as far as I'm concerned, yes, absolutely. There's a law, Declan Hill's law, my thesis, whatever you want to call it, which is the proclivity of match fixing is the amount of money which is bet on a sports team or a sports league, be it Ohio State or Maryland or wherever, and the amount of money the players are receiving. So the NBA, which pays its players really, really, really well, has much less risk of being fixed than the NCAA. And I saw this, Lawrence, when I did an undercover investigation into match fixing at the World Cup of FIFA. And the hidden secret is that many teams don't pay their players. So these guys are running onto the field, about to play Argentina or Germany or England or whatever, full stands, broadcast to billions of people around the world with all kinds of sponsorship, and they're not getting paid. And that is the open door to fixing.
Okay. Rebecca, do you want to reflect on that question with regard to horse racing?
In terms of it's the cheaper races that are more
regularly the ease of fixing horse races, I guess. And then if you can relate it back to the question of whether individual sports, which I think horse racing more or less is, versus team sports are easier to match fix.
I think horse racing has become less of a candidate for fixing actually than something like, I mean, I've been told, I was aware of tennis, but also Russian table tennis is an incredible fad currently. It's been slightly suspended by the Ukraine, in the invasion of Ukraine, but it's these single points. And as Declan and Dara have explained, it's about the granularity of the event. So it's about breaking, it's the really easy to manipulate markets are events that are broken down into far smaller micro elements, all of which can be changed. Whereas a horse race is basically an order. So I think it actually submits less well to the sorts of match fixing we're seeing right now.
Thank you. So we have also a question from Jerry Starcia, who says, student athlete welfare must be front and center, since gambling can only add to the already overloaded SA burden with research supported reduced time for academics and increased mental health issues. Shouldn't university presidents use SA welfare, I guess that's student athlete welfare, as adequate justification to just say no to gambling? Where are the presidents?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure Tom might.
Go ahead. Good, Brian. Yeah, go ahead.
Tom might have a thought on this, and I won't attempt to speak for a university president. That's well above my pay grade. But I will say student athlete welfare is front and center, at least in my mind. And I know I led off talking about those points, but the impact that it has, and we talk about how much attention they get and the pressures they may face and the like, and then obviously college athletics is undergoing a sea of change right now. But the mental health crisis in college athletics and college campuses right now is real. And gambling and the pressures from gambling only exacerbate those issues. So like, this is a real problem, and it's already exacerbating the problem that was already at a crisis level before. So I have real concerns about where this is headed. And again, I hate to point it back to the money, but us provide mental health services in an exacerbated environment costs more for us to be able to do. So I think we've really got to think long and hard about how we can direct some resources supporting this, because it is taxing all involved, especially our student athletes, and as a result, our organizations as we try to support them.
Hey, Andrew, I would say, I think this is kind of above the president in some respects. What's happening in state legislatures directly related to the power of these local betting interests, the casinos and so forth. They really do have enormous power at the state level. And, they're crafting the bills state by state that permits these activities. I saw this when we were in West Virginia. West Virginia was considering a bill, and we went down there to try to make sure that West Virginia and University and all the schools and Marshall and the other schools in the state were going to get some funds out of it. We had no chance. The sports betting interests at the state level are so strong, and that's true across the country. And so, president's kind of in a tough spot because the legislature passes a bill, the governor signs it, they just have to live with it. So in some respects, it goes back to the state legislatures.
Well, certainly state legislatures are key players here, but don't we also want to hold college presidents responsible, particularly in the 17 states that don't have sports gambling legislation? Or if it's too dangerous for an individual president to speak out, what about working through ACE, the American Council of Education, which is a national association of college presidents?
Well, Andrew, let me ask you the question. So a state like Maryland passes it. I'm a member of the Board of Regents. What, the policies you can do, you can say no advertising, you can do things, you can narrow in, but you're not going to be able to stop sports betting that's been legalized by your state. So what do you do in those circumstances?
Well, so at the end of the day, it strikes me, based upon what I've read and also listening to you folks today, that a major part of the remedy has to do with educating the athletes or the bettors in general. They have to be educated about the addictive properties and the dangerous properties of sports betting. And do we even hear college presidents speaking out about that issue? Not necessarily specific policies or legislation that indeed is passed by the state legislature or the federal Congress at some point in the future. But why aren't the college? Maybe they are, and I just don't know about it. Why don't we hear, or why haven't I heard voices of college presidents just talking about the need for education, talking about the dimensions of the problem, even if they don't put forward legislative proposals?
I'll just answer I just went back on the University of Maryland Board of Regents. I can tell you that board is very concerned about sports betting. And I know I haven't even been to my first meeting yet, but I've talked to folks, and I can tell you they're talking about it and they're concerned about it. And I'm sure that's paralleled across the country. So I do think this is growing in awareness across governing boards.
We have another question. It's a very long one, but I think it's all encapsulated by the first sentence. So I'll just read that and see if there are any reactions. Could there be a connection between addictive gambling and mass shootings? No takers on that? Okay.
Drew,
Go ahead.
I'd say one thing. There was that case of that poor losing gambler who shot all those people in Las Vegas a number of years ago. What I noticed about that as a former journalist was how much of the mainstream media refused to mention gambling and the shooting in one sentence. So there was all kinds of questions raised about, his personality, this and that. He's just lost a lot of money. That is an enormous incipient thing. I'm raising only this. Rebecca is really the expert on this and the work, but I would stress something else just as a throwing in part of the conversation. One of the people that I work with here at the university is a former top-level European bookmaker. And I once asked him how many customers he had. And he said, maybe 1 million or so. I said, okay, well, out of that 1 million, how many won? And Tom, his response was 5. And I thought he was saying like 5,000. And he goes, no. Year to year, sports gambling, we had 5 people that were able to beat us. Would have been better for those guys to work on the on the lottery.
Wow. Yeah.
Okay, Tom. Another question. FINRA surveillance SEC regulator works for the stock market. Need a similar structure for gambling. The U.S. knows how to do this. Will we? And that dovetails into another question: is will the federal government ever pass national gambling legislation? Any additional comments on that? I think we've touched on it already.
Real quickly, 2018, former Senator Hatch and Schumer tried. They, it was early days of sports betting. They did not prohibit Olympic and college sports gambling, but yeah, I actually think that this will rise in importance year after year, and some form of that bill will come back, which should include the kind of surveillance and all the other ideas that we discussed on this webinar.
So relatedly, Rebecca and Dara, you've talked about the dance between the parliament and the industry, and that when matters get bad enough and the parliament starts making noises about new regulations, the industry perks up and starts making minor moves. Is that an inevitable dance into the future? Are there any politicians that are taking the lead and trying to do something more substantial?
I don't think anything substantial is happening in politics in the UK currently, I'm afraid to say, for a number of different reasons. But I think what does sometimes shift the dial is a politician in a particular context who really dedicates themselves to this issue. And part of the reason for that is because it's very difficult to understand, and it's not exactly a vote winner. So there are very few incentives to actually take this issue seriously for a politician. So if you have heroes or people, advocates, allies, I suggest you support them and nurture your relationship with them. They're quite often people who've been personally touched by gambling.
Yeah, just to add to that, Andrew, the dance that you mentioned, I think we have seen that dance play out in the UK. I also think that although the state of UK politics may be dire, the recent white paper has kind of involved a series of politicians who have genuinely taken the time that Rebecca's mentioned there to try to understand what are incredibly complex issues, to understand why education, treatment, responsible gambling, problem gambling are bound in an addiction paradigm that will always end up at the door of the individual. These are not easy issues. The industry is incredibly sophisticated in the way in which it operates. But to end on something, well, at least for me, to end on something that I have heard, there is a feeling among, I think, those in the gambling industry in the UK that the recent white paper was inevitable only because of the scale to which they lost control and the scale of the corporate greed that was driving the industry. We're only seeing kind of, we may not have seen a turning of the tide here at all, but we're only seeing any degree of kind of progress in a restrictive policy sense because of how dire things have gotten here. And unfortunately, the dance that you mentioned, I mean, the term that comes to mind is death rather than a dance. And unfortunately, the collateral damage before you get to the point where kind of there is that reckoning at the kind of real politic level, things got to get pretty dire first.
So I'd like to just ask each of you if you have a final comment. We're just about out of time, but if you have anything concluding that you'd like to say, is there any additional comments? Okay, well, look, I think it's been a fascinating discussion, nuanced discussion. I've really enjoyed it, and I'm so appreciative of each of you for participating. If any questions have not been answered during our discussion now, we'll take care of them and give you written answers down the road. Thanks to our listeners for hanging in there, and have a good afternoon, everybody, or evening if you're in England. Thank you very much.